In this video, I'll be introducing John Stuart Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures, and then considering some of the implications this might have for hedonistic accounts of well-being. So far on this course, we've discussed what makes for a good life, or which things constitute well-being. As you saw in the lecture, theories about this are generally divided up into two theories: subjective accounts and objective accounts. On the subjective side, we might think that well-being is best described as the greater balance of pleasure over pain, or so-called hedonistic theories. Alternatively, we might think the good life consists in the satisfaction of our desires or preferences, or perhaps our informed desires or preferences. Objective accounts of the good life hold that there are some things which are good for us regardless of whether we find pleasure in them or they satisfy any of our desires. We might think some of these goods are significant achievement, perhaps acquiring important knowledge, maybe being virtuous, or perhaps being an autonomous individual. The question of what makes a life go well is not a question about which states of affairs are good more generally or from a wider perspective, but what is good for the person, what's in their interests. In this video, we're going to focus on one of the subjective accounts of the good life, namely hedonism. In particular, we'll look at John Stuart Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Then we're going to discuss whether this distinction helps in avoiding a very common criticism of hedonism. To quickly recap on what you already know, hedonism is the view that a good life is a happy life, and that happiness consists in having pleasurable experiences. Conversely, a life which is going badly is a life which, on balance, is filled with painful experiences or tremendous suffering. This is to say that pleasure is the only thing valuable for its own sake or in itself in this view, and that likewise pain is the only thing that's bad in itself or for its own sake. Hedonism thus supposes that one can measure pleasure and pain relative to each other. Many activities and objects will not be valuable for their own sake, but valuable instrumentally, that is, as a means, insofar as they bring about pleasure. Things like drinking wine, eating a Big Mac, or painting. Hedonism has been the subject of a vast number of criticisms. One very common criticism is the idea that there's something demeaning, debasing, or undignified about reducing the value of a life to merely the amount of pleasure experienced. Why might someone think this? Consider the following argument, which I'm just going to call the argument from dignity. Hedonism claims that the mental state of pleasure is the only thing valuable for its own sake, or in itself. All other things have only instrumental value. They have value only insofar as they bring about pleasure. It follows that actions, activities, and so forth can have only instrumental value, and one might think that their value should depend entirely upon the quantity of pleasure they bring about, where quantity is understood as the number of pleasures, their intensity, and their duration. Crucially, this would mean that one kind of activity or pursuit is intrinsically no better than another. If we correctly value one more than another, it must be because the first produces more numerous, intense, or durable pleasures than the other does. This might lead us to an absurd conclusion. Assuming they experience the same amounts of pleasure, it seems then that there is nothing to distinguish the value of a life of creative achievement, perhaps of Beethoven or a Da Vinci type, and that of a life of bodily indulgence, perhaps a serial Netflix binger, or a cat that loves to play with a piece of string. Many have had the intuition that there is something unsettling about this, that there's more to human life than just experiencing vast amounts of pleasure, and that there's some dignity lost in just reducing the good life to this model. John Stuart Mill was a defender of the view that the good life should be defined in terms of pleasure experienced. However, he was particularly sensitive to the force of this criticism. His concern was that this brand of hedonism would be rejected as a doctrine of swine, insofar as it favours a life of sensual pursuits over more noble pursuits. In his utilitarianism, Mill attempts to dodge this criticism by insisting that pleasures can not only be distinguished quantitatively, that is, in terms of how much there is, but also qualitatively. In other words, pleasures can be considered higher or lower based on their nature. He writes that it is quite compatible with hedonism to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while, in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. But what exactly is the distinction between higher and lower pleasures? And more importantly, how does it help confront the problem that hedonism is in some way demeaning or undignified? Mill identifies higher pleasures as those which employ higher faculties. The list of such better enjoyments includes the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments. These enjoyments make use of highly developed capacities like judgment and empathy. The activities that Mill has in mind are things which reflect these capacities and high level of cognitive ability. Things like painting, perhaps writing and discussing philosophy, writing poetry, and composing. Lower pleasures, on the other hand, are those more immediate bodily indulgences which do not require complex capacities. These pleasures are similarly experienced by many non-human animals. Things like eating, drinking, or enjoying a nice summer's day. But on what grounds does Mill make this distinction? In utilitarianism, he takes there to be solid empirical evidence for making the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. He writes, "If I am asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a great amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it, in comparison, of small account." There are a number of claims going on here. Mill's basic point is that the distinction between higher and lower pleasures is explained by reference to the preferences of a competent judge. In other words, those who know what they're talking about. Crucially, Mill claims that if all or almost all of those who are competently acquainted with both of two pleasures agree in giving a decided preference to one of them, then that pleasure is more desirable. From here, Mill claims that it is an unquestionable fact that persons who are familiar with pleasures of the higher faculties, so poetry, art, music, and so forth, prefer these pleasures markedly to the lower, purely physical pleasures for any amount of the lower. It's really important to understand that the competent judge's decision is not what makes one experience more valuable than another, but rather this ranking by experts gives us good reason to believe that certain pleasures are superior in quality. In one of his most famous passages, Mill claims that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, and if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So Mill's claim here is that these experts have experience with both lower pleasures and higher pleasures. And his claim is that these experts will always choose higher pleasures over lower ones, and this indicates that they're more valuable. In presenting his case, Mill often implicitly and sometimes explicitly appeals to dignity in order to justify the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. For Mill, it's the dignity of the competent judges which explains their uniform preference for activities which exercise rational capacity. He says, "We may give what explanation we please of this unwillingness on the part of a competent judge ever to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. But its most appropriate appellation is a sense of dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or another, and in some, though by no means in exact, proportion to their higher faculties." How successful is Mill's account of higher and lower pleasures, and does it avoid the problem that we set out earlier? Mill seems to be onto something when criticizing traditional quantitative accounts of hedonism. Human beings do seem to be capable of much more than just experiencing bodily pleasures, that there's great potential because of our relatively highly developed cognitive abilities. Mill's distinction is significant because it captures the intuition that there's something better about some pleasures relative to others, and that collectively we should measure the quality of life not by crudely adding up how much pleasure they experienced, but also considering what kinds of pleasures they experienced. However, there may be reasons to be skeptical about Mill's distinction. Are there such competent judges that can reliably measure the goods of drinking wine with reading Tolstoy, for example? Some people have certainly experienced more than others, and can have more refined tastes, but is the extent of what Mill has in mind very plausible? Is the distinction, and the goods that are informed by it, in some way reflected by Mill's position in society? If so, that wouldn't make his view wrong, but it might give us reason to be suspicious about the project as a whole. A more pressing issue is whether Mill can make this distinction and still remain a hedonist. In other words, Mill's distinction may solve the problem that the argument from dignity raises, but at the expense of abandoning hedonism and adopting a more objective view of the good life. This is reflected in Mill's appeal to dignity. There are two things we can say about this. First of all, if dignity is valuable for its own sake as a constitutive element of well-being, then that sounds anti-hedonistic, because then it wouldn't be the case that it's just pleasure which makes a life go well, but also dignity. There's a second way to interpret this concept, which also runs into problems if we want to maintain a hedonistic account of well-being. In claiming that it is the dignity of a life in which the higher capacities are exercised, and the competent judge's sense of her own dignity that explains her preferences for those activities, Mill implies that her preferences reflect judgments about the value that these activities have independently of their being the object of desire or the source of pleasure. So in other words, on this view, we take pleasure in these activities because they are valuable. They are not valuable because they are pleasurable. This is important because we need to be absolutely clear about on what grounds something has value. Is reading poetry good for you because it brings you pleasure? Or does reading poetry bring you pleasure because it's valuable? Mill seems to be tempting us to adopt the second view, and that sounds anti-hedonistic. These inconsistencies have prompted subsequent philosophers into thinking that Mill isn't really committed to hedonism, but rather a more objective account of what makes a life go well, as someone who claims that human happiness consists in the proper exercise of those capacities essential to our nature. However we should interpret Mill, his distinction between higher and lower pleasures certainly gives us a lot to think about. For more on this distinction, check out the entry on Mill's moral and political philosophy on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.